and welcome to the Landlord Seminar presented by the City of Lakewood. My name is Ernie Vargo, Law Director for the City of Lakewood. On behalf of Mayor Megan George and her entire administration, we offer this seminar for your benefit. The seminar is to supply you with information you need to provide a safe and high-quality rental unit for your tenants. It is also to help you understand the city's ordinances and building regulations applicable to your role as a landlord. City Hall and the building department are open to you during workday business hours, but you will find all of the applicable ordinances, regulations, permit applications, payment information online at the city's webpage. Still, do not hesitate to contact the building department in person or by phone with any questions or concerns you may ever have. Also on the city's webpage is a manual entitled Best Rental Practices. This manual is another resource for you to review and become familiar with. The manual further speaks to requirements applicable to your role and responsibility as a landlord. Now let me introduce the speakers for today's seminar. First, you'll hear from Municipal Court Judge Tess Neff on the court's role in enforcing the city's building and housing code. Next, you'll hear from a representative of the Fair Housing Center. Then, Mr. Chris Parmalee will address you. Mr. Parmalee is the building commissioner for the City of Lakewood and is most knowledgeable about the city's building and housing ordinances. Finally, you'll hear from attorney Andrew Fleck, one of the city's prosecutors. Mr. Fleck will address the city's nuisance ordinance and process. We certainly hope you never have a problem in complying with the city's regulations, but we do and must take seriously the importance of the nuisance procedures. So please pay careful attention to the information provided by each of our presenters today. Now, it is my privilege to introduce to you Judge Tess Neff. Thank you.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for taking time out of your day to learn and educate yourself about landlord-tenant law. Some of you may know our city is comprised of almost 50% rental property, so there is a lot of opportunity for landlords and tenants alike. A little about me: I was elected to Lakewood Municipal Court Judge in November 21, and I've lived in Lakewood over 3 decades and raised my family here. And I bring a unique experience to the court in that I've not only been a tenant in Lakewood, but a landlord as well. And I also served as a magistrate in Lakewood Municipal Court for 10 years, where I did hear the housing docket. So I truly do understand both sides of the issues. That being said, I'm going to share my screen here in a moment and go through a short PowerPoint and try to give you some information that will be useful to you in the future. So let's get started. Okay, as I said, I am Judge Tess Neff, Lakewood Municipal Court. So our first slide, I'm going to start talking about Ohio Revised Code 5321. There's 2 codes that really pertain to you as a landlord, and this is one of them. It governs all residential leases, and it also includes the obligations required of you as a landlord as well as the tenant. And they're all spelled out, and I really encourage you to familiarize yourself so that you don't make mistakes in the law that would set you back as a landlord. And with respect to 5321-06, the last bullet point, there can be no inconsistencies in your lease that contradict the statute. So you need to pay attention to that. Okay, I'm going to talk about rent, and that's money paid by the tenant for use and occupancy of the premises. And there's some important information you really should include in your rental agreement. One is the amount of rent. It needs to be clear, and as well as the time and place you want the rent paid. Some landlords will encourage or prefer their manager or themselves to pick up the rent. That needs to be outlined in your lease and indicate what day of the month. For example, you can't show up on the 1st, expect the rent from your tenant when your lease says it's the 5th day of the month. If you prefer to have your rent mailed to you, it's important you include the address in your lease so the tenant doesn't have any questions. This I want to mention, it's really important. A lot of landlords make mistakes about this, that if you give in to your tenant and make a habit of accepting late or partial rent and let them catch up, you may waive your right to have rent paid timely to you. And you may have to give them notice in the future if you want to get back on track with having rent paid at the time that you indicate in your lease. Revised Code 532104. This outlines your obligations as a landlord. You cannot modify these obligations in your lease or put any of these obligations on your tenant. I'm not going to read through all 9 of these, but there's a couple I want to highlight. The first one, complying with building and housing codes. This is critical, especially with Lakewood's housing stock. We have a lot of older homes. And you're going to hear in this presentation from the building commissioner. He will review the issues of building and housing codes. Very important you pay attention to that. 2, it's incumbent upon you to make repairs. For example, say the front rail on your rental property breaks and you're put on notice by your tenant and you blow it off for several weeks, maybe months, because you just can't get to it. And if something happens where a guest or the tenant is injured, it could cause a lot of problems for you. So making repairs as reasonably, timely as you can is very important. Number 6 is a big one. You've got to maintain running water, reasonable heat, and hot water. If the hot water tank breaks, you need to take care of that very quickly, as soon as possible. Number 7 is important. You can't abuse your right to access the property. Yes, you are the owner, but you just can't show up sporadically and want to walk through the premises and inspect. You must give notice to your tenant, and it has to be reasonable. You can't give them an hour notice unless it's an emergency, but typically 24 hours to come to the property and meet with the tenant is usually acceptable. Now, just like you have obligations as a landlord, your tenant also has obligations that are outlined in the law. And again, I'm not going to run through each of them. They're unlike with the landlord, you may assume some of the tenant's obligations. An example is you provide the kitchen appliances for your tenant. It's a rental property, let's say a duplex. And you agree to maintain those appliances. That's okay. But if you want the tenant to do it, it's in the statute and they would be required to do that unless there's an agreement to the contrary. The tenant's obligated to keep the rental premises safe and sanitary. They can't have the garbage, skewed up, thrown all over the place. 6 is an important one. It prohibits others on the property from damaging your property. So say one of your tenants has a party and it gets a little rowdy and they're throwing things around, maybe holes are in the wall. Your tenant is responsible for that, for the repairs, because their guests caused it. Another one that's important, it happens a lot. We get a lot of these complaints because the Lakewood homes and the apartment units are so close together. Number 8, the tenant cannot disturb the peaceful enjoyment of others, meaning they can't have a party, on the weekdays with very loud music that would be considered unreasonable at say 2 or 3 in the morning when everyone else has to get up and work. If you get complaints from a tenant that this is happening from another tenant, you must take action. You're going to have to send a notice and give them, time to correct the action, but it could cause a problem if it's not corrected. The Ohio Revised Code Chapter 1923. This is your eviction statute. otherwise known as forcible entry and detainer. It's when you as the landlord are seeking to terminate your tenant's rights to be on the property. In eviction, it's a statutory process that must strictly be followed. You cannot cut corners. If you do, your case will be dismissed. The process is set up to permit the landlord to recover the property pretty quickly once the 3-day notice is served. Your responsibility as the landlord is to show that there is a valid lease between you and your tenant. In addition, you need to show that the tenant caused damage to your property or they're not paying their rent. And it's very important to make sure you serve the proper notices to your tenant. And after those notices, your tenant remains on the property. I'm going to talk about the notices now. And this topic can get a little confusing, especially for new landlords. And even some of the veteran landlords make mistakes on occasion. So if you as landlord want to terminate the tenancy, a 30-day notice is required, okay? So a 30-day notice is very different than a 3-day notice. They're two separate notices. If it's an eviction action for non-payment of rent, a 30-day notice is not required. It's only the 3-day notice. The landlord must provide the tenant notice that he or she is terminating the tenancy. You must do that in writing. Most tenancies are periodic in that they're month to month. And I have the Ohio Revised Code section there for you. So if you want to terminate a periodic tenancy or the tenancy because your tenant is violating the statutory obligations that I just previously spoke about, you need to serve a 30-day notice. And I'm going to give you an example of how that works. So a 30-day notice always will need to be served prior to the next periodic tenancy. For example, month-to-month tenant. If you want your tenant off the property because they're violating the statute, or you just want to terminate the tenancy, you want them out by September 30th. If you serve the 30-day notice on September 1, your case is going to be dismissed. You need to serve that notice the month prior. So the latest you could serve that 30-day notice would be August 31st. And then, you would be in a good position. Now I'm going to talk about the 3-day notice, and that's under 1923.04. What I mean by jurisdiction required is the tenant and the property have to be within the boundaries of the city of Lakewood. That's the only way you could file an eviction action in Lakewood Municipal Court. Now, a 3-day notice must contain this mandatory statutory language. I list the statute, and it's very specific. And it starts off, you are being asked to leave the premises. If you don't leave, an eviction action may be initiated against you, and it goes on. It's very important. The entire language is included in your 3-day notice. The 3-day notice must be in writing, and it must be conspicuous. What I mean by that is, say you're sending in a letter form, the 1923.04 language must be, I would bold it and capitalize it so that it's obvious to the tenant what this notice is about. Now, the 3-day, I talked about a 30-day. The 3-day is in addition to the 30-day. And I'm going to give you an example. Landlord serves a 30-day notice to the tenant because the landlord wants to terminate the lease for other than non-payment of rent. Your tenant stays past the 30th day. It is at that time, then you need to serve a 3-day notice. That's the quick process, in which always will come after the 30-day notice. Sometimes landlords make a mistake. They want to terminate the tenancy and they serve the 3-day notice first for eviction and then the 30-day. and that's wrong. It has to be the 30-day first. So you're entitled to monetary damages in certain circumstances. Monetary damages can be collected for unpaid rent. So I'm going to give the example here where the landlord, you terminate the tenancy and you do it mid-lease because let's say the tenant hypothetically was violating their statutory obligation. So you do the proper 30-day notice and the tenant leaves. They leave in June. Your lease runs through December of the same year. It's your obligation to mitigate the damages for rent. What I mean by that is you'll be asked in the hearing, did you make efforts to re-rent the property? What have you done to do that? Did you advertise? You can't just sit there with your feet up and say, oh, I've got 6 months, to bank up this unpaid rent. It doesn't work that way. You have to make efforts to try to mitigate the amount of rent that may be owed once your tenant vacates. You also can recover reasonable late fees. That has changed. You'll see I have in parentheses there reference Lakewood Ordinance 02/2023. I will address that in the end, but it's new legislation that was passed in February by Lakewood City Council. And I'll go over that with you once I finish here. And rent typically is not prorated when a tenant leaves unless you have it in the lease. So if your tenant leaves, say June 15, you in most cases are able to collect the entire month's rent as damages. Now, actual damages to the rental property. You are required as a landlord to show actual damages. A lot of landlords come in with this list of just automatic deductions, just a list that will say cleaning expense, $150, moving a property, $200. That's not acceptable, and the magistrate nor I would consider that. You have to be able to provide receipts of damages or repairs you had to have done, the contractor who did it, or if you did the repairs, your reasonable cost of labor. And damages have to be beyond ordinary or reasonable wear and tear to the property. I mean, think of our own homes, paint can get chipped. We bump up against some, with a wall with, something we're carrying. Carpet gets worn because of walking the same path. The same happens with tenants, and you can't collect damages from them for if it's ordinary reasonable wear and tear. You're also responsible to show diminution in value of property. For example, the carpet. Let's say you install brand new carpet when your tenant moved in. And let's presume you kept the receipt for that, which has the date and the cost of the carpet. If when your tenant moves out, there's stains on the carpet, cigarette burns, well, that's a whole different story because it's damaged most likely beyond repair. So that's an example you can show, the value of the property is lessened because of the carpet being destroyed. No other tenant is going to want to come in and move in with that type of condition carpet. Evidence at your hearing to prove damages is critical. Like I mentioned earlier, I believe you need receipts. You should have receipts. You should have photos. Don't rely on the magistrate or the judge to make your case for you. Important that you come in prepared, because we hear the evidence and make a decision based on the facts, the testimony, and the evidence. If you don't have evidence of damages, it's going to be really hard to prevail in your case. Okay, now we're at the point of the new legislation I referenced earlier that Lakewood City Council passed in February. It's called the Pay to Stay Rental Eviction Actions. Several suburbs have already enacted this. Cleveland City of Cleveland has it. And it's very tenant friendly. And it only applies to non-payment of rent cases. It doesn't affect you if you want to terminate the lease regarding a 30-day notice because you want to end that tenancy. So it's only for non-payment of rent. And basically, this legislation allows a tenant, if they can come up with all the past due rent, including reasonable late fees, and give it to you, the law says you are required to accept it, whether you want to or not. If you choose not to, then it can be an affirmative defense for the tenant at future hearings. And based on this legislation, there's probably a good chance that you would not prevail. And it just would cause you a whole nother headache because you may have to allow that tenant to come back. So this legislation is effective prior to you filing the eviction action. Say your tenant owes you 2 months rent. You're getting ready to file the eviction action. They come up with the 2 months rent and reasonable late fees for those 2 months. You're required to accept it. The same holds true prior to an eviction judgment. So let's say you filed the eviction action with the court. The hearing is set. And the tenant comes up with the past due rent and the late fees and the court costs that you had to pay to file the action. Again, you're required to accept the monies and you must dismiss the eviction action against the tenant. And although I believe this is very tenant friendly, it also protects the landlords because you need to be made whole before you have to accept the unpaid rents and any late fees. And I mean, I have to say as a landlord too, we all know it's a real pain to get a new tenant. You have to ready the property and there's costs involved. So if you can work it out, mediate with your tenant that they stay, it tends to work well. And the magistrates can help with that. They mediate the cases as they come in as well. And then also, once an eviction is granted, the tenant still has a third chance to come up with all the monies that's owed you, and you are required to accept it. And again, it's an affirmative defense in any of those circumstances if you choose not to accept. Number 4 there, payment of rent. It does not have to come from the tenant. There's a lot of nonprofits out there that are helping tenants who are in need with vouchers for payment of their rent. That would be considered a rent payment toward what they owe, and you would have to accept that as well. You'll recall I mentioned the late fees. So this new legislation caps it. Late fees are either $25 or 5% of the monthly rent. So you have to keep that in mind if some of you tenants who are, landlords who have been in the business a while and your lease says something otherwise, you will be held to this legislation. And the landlord must give the tenant a signed receipt. This is new for the security deposit and all rent payments. There's an exception if the tenant pays by check, but we all know there's a lot of tenants who pay by cash, and you are required to give them a receipt. This could be problematic for you if you don't, because it's going to be your word against your tenants if it comes down to an eviction action. So it puts a little more burden on the landlord in that respect. So just be aware that you can print this legislation from the City of Lakewood's website under the legislation through City Council. So if you want to get a copy of that, I recommend you do read it. I put the highlights in here, but it's not the full ordinance. Okay, so I'm going to stop sharing my screen here. There we go. So there's one more item I want to talk about because it seems to be a trend. People are filing applications with many of the municipal courts to have their prior eviction actions sealed. Now, unlike a criminal case, there is no statutory authority to do this. However, there's an initiative going on with legal aid and other legal groups to assist tenants because many tenants have difficulty buying a home, renting other properties because they have the eviction on their case. So what is happening, I'm not going to go into the case law, but there's a couple cases that have been decided through Ohio courts that give an avenue for a means to seal an eviction action or a civil case. And there's certain criteria that the tenant must meet in order to have it granted. I've had probably 10 since I've started. Some I've sealed, some I have not. And there's just a lot of factors that I need to look at in order to do that. And some of them are, just to give you an idea, is how old is the eviction? Has the landlord been made whole? Is there still an outstanding judgment? If there is, I am not going to seal that record. Does it prejudice the landlord? And it's very important, the tenant or the applicant must notify the landlord, their prior landlord. They must send them notice that they're filing this, and you have an opportunity to appear at the hearing if you choose, or object, or both. So keep that in mind. So there's a lot of factors that go into play, but I just wanted you to be aware of that in case you do get a notice from a former tenant. And if you do object or you're adamantly opposed, certainly your voice will be heard by the court. So in closing, there's two resources I want to share with you. I'm going to hold them up and hopefully you can see them on the screen. They're resources that the court uses, the magistrates, I do. I have no connection to these authors. We have to pay for the books like anybody else, but they're valuable resources that would be really helpful to you. I encourage you to invest in it. They're pretty expensive, but once you have it, I mean, you have it for life as a landlord. The first one is Ohio Landlord Tenant Law. This one is great because it's very layman friendly, meaning you don't have to be an attorney to understand the language in it. It gives you, there's a lot of Q&A and sample forms. So this is a very good one. Also, I just acquired this. This is also very good, Ohio Eviction and Landlord Tenant Law. So two resources you may want to invest in and check into. All right, well, it was my pleasure to present to you today. I hope you got some valuable information, and I wish you much success as a landlord in the city of Lakewood. Thank you.
So again, my name is Tanisha Hunter, and I am the Director of Education and Outreach at the Fair Housing Center for Rights and Research. This presentation will provide general information. So for any specific legal advice, we do recommend consulting an attorney. The Fair Housing Center for Rights and Research is a not-for-profit fair housing agency that promotes equal housing opportunities and positive race relations in Northeast Ohio. Our mission is to protect and expand fair housing rights, eliminate housing discrimination, and promote integrated communities. We advance this core mission through some services, which includes advocacy, complaint investigation. Our advocates are available to assist victims of housing discrimination and offers free assistance to victims in the administrative complaint process. Enforcement, research, and just like today, education and community engagement. The Federal Fair Housing Act was signed into law on April 11th, 1968 by President Lyndon B. Johnson. Fair housing is a right afforded to all people living in the United States. Federal, state, and local fair housing laws exist to protect people living in the United States from housing discrimination. Over the years, there have been many policies and practices that were put into place that have perpetuated discrimination in housing, whether it was racial residential segregation or forcing people with disabilities to live in segregated housing. When the law was signed into place in 1968, it had two goals. One, to eliminate housing discrimination, and then also to promote residential integration and undo the effects of prior discriminatory policies and practices, which is also known as affirmatively furthering fair housing. The Fair Housing Act defines the term dwelling in very broad terms. So some examples of some covered properties under the Fair Housing Law includes homes, apartments, condos, manufactured mobile homes, nursing homes, assisted living facilities, residential recovery housing, transitional housing, dorm rooms, extended stay hotels, timeshares, and even vacant land intended for residential construction. Protected classes. The Federal Fair Housing Act has 7 protected classes, which includes race, color, and this can actually be intragroup discrimination. So for example, members of the same race might discriminate because someone is too light or too dark. National origin includes birthplace, culture, and language. Religion, sex, which now federally includes sexual orientation and gender identity. Familial status, which is the presence of children under the age of 18 living with a parent or a guardian or a person in the process of securing legal custody, and also includes pregnant women. Disability, we'll talk about just a little bit later. Ohio then has some additional protected classes, which includes ancestry, which is a somewhat broader term than national origin, military status. And then in Cuyahoga County in 2018, legislation was passed to include sexual orientation and gender identity before it was allowed on the federal level. Then, depending on where you might own property, there may be some additional protected classes, which might include, again, sexual orientation and gender identity, gender, marital status, parental status, source of income, creed, physical characteristics, age, and then even associations with a protected class. Protected classes that you see on the screen here that have an asterisk by them are all protected classes included in Lakewood's Fair Housing Ordinance. Now, let's talk a little bit more in depth about protections for people with disabilities. The Fair Housing Act, the Americans with Disabilities Act, also known as the ADA, and Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act protect individuals with disabilities from discrimination in housing, including individuals with mental health, intellectual, or developmental disabilities. Often these laws overlap in their coverage, but some housing may be covered by only one of the laws, while other housing may be specific to 2 or 3 of the laws. Titles 2 and 3 of the Americans with Disabilities Act prohibit discrimination on the basis of disability in all programs, services, and activities of public entities and by private entities that own, operate, or lease places of public accommodation. So what that means for a housing provider is that if you have a private entity that's a covered dwelling under the Fair Housing Act that includes a public accommodation, ADA laws would pertain to that property. Disability definition under Fair Housing Law. A person is protected as a person with a disability under Fair Housing Law if they meet one or more of the following conditions: have a physical and or mental impairment which substantially limits one or more major life activities. A major life activity might include seeing, speaking, breathing, working. Record of having such impairment, being regarded as having such impairment, and also includes people associated with or residing with person meeting definition. So some examples of covered disabilities under the Fair Housing Act includes chronic mental illness, hearing, mobility, and visual impairments, cancer, AIDS, HIV, developmental disabilities, and then also alcoholism or past drug abuse. The Fair Housing Act does not protect current illegal drug users and anyone who poses a direct threat to the health and safety of others or causes substantial physical damage to the property. The Fair Housing Act includes some additional protections and special considerations for persons with disabilities. This includes a reasonable accommodation, which is a change to your policy or procedure that governs the residents, and also a reasonable modification, which is a physical change to the property. There are also new construction requirements that equal 7 accessibility features on new construction, which we'll talk about in just a little bit here. Some examples of reasonable accommodation requests, which again is a change in the policy, is to allow service animals despite you having a no pet policy, informing others such as a family member or social worker of new policies and procedures, allowing a non-tenant to use the laundry room if your tenant is unable to do so, moving from one unit to another without a fee, reserved parking spaces, allowing a live-in aid, changing the rent due date. So for example, if a person receives their disability income on the 3rd Wednesday of the month, allowing them to change the rent due date to the day that they receive their check. And then also utilizing the Ohio Relay Service. Some examples of reasonable modifications might include widening doorways, installing grab bars, lowering the heights of kitchen cabinets, installing a ramp, installing automatic water faucet shutoffs, installing or removing carpeting, lowering or raising the heights of switches, outlets, and thermostats, and then installing levered door handles instead of the orbital ones that you typically see on older homes. For reasonable accommodations and modifications, the tenant is responsible for requesting the modification or accommodation from the housing provider. The accommodation or modification must be related to the person's disability, cannot cause an undue financial and administrative burden, and cannot be a fundamental alteration of the normal service provisions. So for example, if a person becomes disabled and loses their income and they make a request to maybe perhaps have their rent lowered, that might be considered to be an undue financial and administrative burden for the housing provider. And therefore a housing provider would not be required to make that reasonable accommodation. However, a housing provider must grant the accommodation or modification if it meets the aforementioned criteria. So let's talk a little bit about your responsibilities as a housing provider when it comes to reasonable accommodations and modifications. You as a housing provider can ask for proof of the disability if it is not readily apparent. Asking for proof that the person with a disability requires the requested accommodation or modification because of their disability. And this can be proven by getting a letter from the tenant that is signed by their medical or social service provider or mental health professional or someone with intimate knowledge of the disability. A housing provider, however, cannot ask any questions about the nature or the extent of that person's disability, require the person with a disability to disclose their diagnosis, ask for medical records, ask how long a person has had a disability, or charge fees for any reasonable accommodations. Again, that's the changes in policies. Paying for reasonable modifications. It is typically the tenant's responsibility for paying for a reasonable modification. There are 2 instances when a housing provider may be required to pay for the modification. If the building receives federal financial assistance, or if the building was built for first occupancy after March 13th, 1991, and the modification is covered under new construction requirements, which we will talk about just shortly here. So the process for requesting a reasonable accommodation or modification, a tenant makes the request, and requests can be made at any time. The application process, before leasing up, anytime during the tenancy. You as a housing provider should document all reasonable accommodation and modification requests, including verbal requests. The housing provider must respond in a timely manner. Remember, if someone is requesting a reasonable accommodation or modification, it is because they can't enjoy the dwelling equally. So responses should be timely. A housing provider can ask for documentation if the disability is not readily known, apparent, or if the connection to the disability is not clear. Documentation can be provided by a medical, social service, mental health professional, or someone with intimate knowledge of a person's disability. The letter does not have to disclose the person's diagnosis, nature, or extent. It only needs to state that the person has a covered disability under the Fair Housing Law and that it impacts one or more major life activities and that the requested reasonable accommodation or modification is needed due to their disability. Now, new construction requirements. 7 require accessibility features on new construction. So when the Fair Housing Amendments Act was passed in 1988, new construction laws were put into place to ensure that multifamily housing with 4 or more units were built accessible for people with disabilities. Any building that meets that criteria must have the new 7 design features. This includes an accessible entrance on an accessible route. So thinking, can a person using a wheelchair get from the parking lot into the buildings? Are the doorways wide enough? Public common areas that are accessible. So public common areas might include lobbies, pools, picnic areas, mailboxes, and laundry rooms. Thinking, are these common areas accessible enough for a person with a wheelchair to access them? Usable doors. Are the doors usable by a person in a wheelchair? Are they wide enough? Is there a high threshold in the doorway, which makes it difficult to enter? Accessible route into and through the unit. Is the entrance of the apartments wide enough? Are there accommodations available for a person to be able to use a wheelchair to get from one room to another without encountering any narrow doorways or high thresholds? Then light switches, outlets, thermostats are in accessible locations. Light switches should be available and temperature control areas are low enough so that a person utilizing a wheelchair are able to reach them sitting down. Reinforced walls in the bathrooms. This is in the event that a person needs to install grab bars. Are they going to be able to do so safely without the grab bars going through the wall? Then lastly, usable kitchens and baths. Can a person using a wheelchair easily access the sink using a parallel approach? If the kitchen is too small to accommodate a parallel approach, is there knee space below the sink to make it accessible? These are the 7 construction requirements for new multifamily dwellings, again, 4 or more units that were built for first occupancy after March 13, 1991. Now to talk a little bit about prohibited acts. We've talked about covered property, protected classes. Now let's talk about what exactly is housing discrimination. It's the refusal to sell, rent, negotiate, or otherwise make unavailable or deny a dwelling. So for example, a family attempts maybe to rent an apartment. The landlord states that they don't allow children in their apartment. That would be a familial status violation. Discriminate in the terms, conditions, or privileges of the sale or rental of a dwelling, or in the provision of services or facilities. For example, a prospective tenant speaks with an accent, and although it is not your policy, a housing provider asks for proof of citizenship. This would be a national origin or ancestry violation. Make, print, or publish any notice, statement, or ad indicating a preference or limitation based on a protected class. You want to be describing your property and not an ideal tenant. Misrepresenting availability, denying someone a reasonable accommodation or modification request. In the event you have to deny a reasonable accommodation or modification request, you should always engage in an interactive process with the tenant. So, that you can see other ways that the person might equally enjoy the dwelling. And then intimidating, threatening, interfering with, or otherwise retaliating against a person who is exercising their fair housing rights. Lastly, in discriminatory acts, it's important to note that Ohio Fair Housing Law makes it unlawful to make any inquiry, elicit any information, make or keep any record, or use any form of application containing questions or entries concerning any protected class. Therefore, your rental applications should not be asking questions about a person's disability, race, or if they have children. Anything concerning a protected class should not be included on rental applications. And lastly, as we get ready to close, let's talk about consequences and goals of fair housing. So what are the consequences? If you're found to be violating the fair housing law, potentially a lawsuit or complaint and investigation, and if probable cause is found, then an administrative hearing where damages could be awarded, including compensatory damages, punitive damages, and injunctive or equitable relief. And for real estate professionals, possibly even a loss of license. What are the consequences of following the laws? One can be a force for good, working toward promoting the American dream of housing and home ownership for all. Avoid unnecessary fines and penalties or lawsuits, and the personal satisfaction of complying with the law and promoting everyone's right to equal housing. Housing is a critical facet of life, including physical and mental health, quality of life, access to education, economic outcomes. And so with that being said, safe, stable, and affordable housing is a necessity to achieving many other human rights. Therefore, accessing without barriers is critical. So you as a housing provider are doing the right step right now in ensuring that you are not being discriminatory by understanding your obligations as a housing provider. So lastly, I'll leave you with a couple best practices. One, design a non-discriminatory list of rental criteria. Review the applications in the order that they are received, and then approve the first qualified applicant. Advertise your available unit, describe the property, not the people that you think may be interested. If conducting a credit and or background check, obtain written authorization from the applicant and adhere to both fair credit and fair housing law. In 2016, HUD issued guidance on applying Fair Housing Act standards to the use of criminal records. If you haven't had the opportunity to take a look at that document, I would highly suggest reviewing it. Remember, everyone with a disability has the right to request an accommodation and a right to response in a timely manner. Document all requests for accommodation, including verbal. And then again, if you must deny, engage in the interactive process if the requested accommodation or modification has to be denied. Remember, a person is requesting that so that they can enjoy the dwelling equally. And with that, if you have any further questions about fair housing law and need some additional guidance, you can always give us a call or follow us on social media to get in contact with us. Thank you.
Good morning, good evening, good afternoon, whatever time you're watching. Thanks for joining us. Again, thanks for sitting through one of the landlord training seminars. We do this twice a year to make sure everybody's up to date on any current codes, changes in the code, and all that good stuff. We have all kinds of good information. Thanks for joining us. If you're a repeater, we appreciate it. We also appreciate your investment in the neighborhood. As you heard from Law Director Ernie Vargo, my name is Chris Parmalee. I'm the building commissioner. Many of you know me. If you're new to the city, welcome. So we're going to jump right in to the presentation. Again, my name is Chris Parmalee, the building commissioner, housing officer, floodplain administrator. I wear a lot of hats. My wife and I both live here with one son now. If you've heard the presentation years before, it was 3 in the house. We're down to 1. Both my older 2 are graduates from City of Lakewood High School. It's home to us. The economic and social diversity, the walkability, architecture, sense of community. That's what makes Lakewood unique, and we're proud to call this place home. We really appreciate the investment that you've made in our neighborhood. It means a lot, and welcome. A little bit of information, Lakewood by the numbers, pre-census. So we're super dense. We're the most densely populated city, next to Chicago in the northeastern portion of the United States here, 50,866 residents. That equates to like over 9,200 residents per square mile. We have 3,200 housing units, 45% owner occupied, 55% rental. That number fluctuates year to year. Median home value right around 171,000. We just said walkability. We have 180 miles of sidewalks to get us there, 92 miles of road, and we are densely packed into 5.6 square miles. So your interaction with the building department will be a little different depending on what you call us for. But when it comes to the rental piece, we do exterior and interior and exterior inspections. The exterior inspections, those are completed from a public space, meaning public right of way, sidewalk, streets. We have a curtilage law that we cannot pass the front foundation of the house. We can go on a front porch, just as you would welcome, Amazon, UPS to the front porch. We do safety and maintenance inspections on all rental properties. It's a basic safety and maintenance inspection just to ensure the safety of your tenants and make sure the property's, being upkept. That's about every 4 years, depending on staff and all that good stuff. If your property does get selected for a safety and maintenance inspection, you will receive an inspection request by mail. You'll get a letter in the mail. It's going to have the inspection date on there, typically 10 days from the date that letter was sent. Your inspector's information will be on there. If that date doesn't work for some reason, call your inspector. We can reschedule, but it is imperative that we get that inspection done. The other inspections we do, it's called a certificate of code compliance inspection. So anytime you have a rental property in the city of Lakewood and you do sell that, you get a certificate of code compliance inspection. Some municipalities still refer to them as point of sales, but we do call them CFCCs. It's the exact same inspection as a safety and maintenance inspection. The only difference is your buyer gets copied or CC'd on the violation letter that gets sent to you. It is required by our codified ordinance to have this inspection done. If you have any questions or concerns regarding that inspection, feel free to call our office. We do issue the housing licenses for all rental properties too. Any rental property that you have in the city is required by codified ordinance to have a housing license. That's annual. Those licenses expire November 1st of each calendar year, and they're non-transferable. And they don't get prorated either. So if you buy a rental property in October, pay for a housing license, that housing license is only going to get you through November 1st. There's no other stipulations other than that. And again, they're non-transferable. And I do understand it could be a financial restraint. If you do buy something late in the season, we've worked with people before. If that question never comes up, you can call me direct. We can work through that. On that license, if you are an out-of-state or out-of-city owner, you're required by ordinance to have a local representative that is in charge of maintenance for that property. So somebody local that we can count on if there is issues with the property. And then we get complaints from tenants if there's an issue with their suite, the neighbors, if there's an issue with the property, city officials, refuse. So there's different interactions that happen with the building department. And of course, if you decide to do renovations on your property, the plan review process, permitting process, that's all handled through our office as well. This is an important one. So seasonal responsibilities, meaning summer season, we all have grass and bushes to trim. And in the wintertime, we have snow removal. So if your grass gets over 6 inches, or you have bushes that grow over 36 inches that impede visibility from the right of way, it's your responsibility to maintain that. If the grass or bushes exceed that, one of our property maintenance folks will essentially send you a correction notice to have that maintained. If you fail to maintain that by codified ordinance, we'll come and trim the bushes or cut the grass, and we charge $200 that gets assessed to the property. We don't like doing that, but sometimes we have to. The other responsibility, we talked earlier about our 180 miles of sidewalks. We have many schools in the district. We don't bus, all the kids walk. It's imperative by ordinance that 24 hours after the snowfall, that snow and ice gets cleared. If shoveling your driveway or your service walk for the mailman, there's no difference there. And when we talk about clearing snow from the property, and we talk about maintaining the lawn area of the property, if you have an agreement with your tenant, that's great. But at the end of the day, you being the property owner are the responsible party. So if you call and say, hey, my tenant was supposed to cut the grass, they didn't get to it. We don't essentially want to hear the excuses. We just want you to maintain the property. We don't like sending correction notices for high grass or snow removal. But it is part of our job, and it's part of what we're bound to do by the city. And again, if you have a tenant that's supposed to maintain the grass and they fail to do so, and you're not local, we do ask that you have a lawn care company come and take care of that grass every other week or whatever it is. And if there is an issue, a sickness or, some other reason that you can't get to the grass, we can work with you, but we just can't let these lots overgrow. We're very close to each other. So we need to make sure we're all on the same page maintaining our property. We spoke about some housing licenses. This slide here breaks it down pretty good. So all owner occupied single family, 2, 3 multifamily apartment buildings, rental condos, vacant properties are required to have that license or registration. The only caveat is if you have a 2-family home and you rent 1 story out and live in the other, you're exempt from the housing license. A vacant property license is required for all vacant properties. So if you inherit a home from a family member, you buy a piece of property and you don't have any intentions of doing anything with it for a year, you get what's called that vacant property license. And what that does is we retain the information. If there is an event, heaven forbid, the police or fire department have to be called, we maintain that information and we can provide that to first responders. And again, that gives us information in case that lot does get overgrown or there's snow removal issues of that sort. Housing licenses expire November 1st, non-transferable, and they cannot be prorated. We went over that. All housing license reminders, we start sending those out in late August. So we'll send one in August, we send 2 in September, 2 in October. We'll send late notices in November. All that's done through our Citizen Serve customer facing portal. When you do apply or renew for a housing license, it's imperative that we have a good email address that you can get contacted with. All that notification goes through our Citizen Serve portal. We used to send, letters, reminders. We have 3,000 licenses that get issued for rental property. It's very expensive for the city and postage. When we went on this new platform, we found that we can save city taxpayers right around $10,000 a year in postage. And in this day and age, 2023, there's a lot of notifications that happen via email. So again, it's really important that we have an accurate email address so we can communicate with you, the property owner, when it comes to housing licenses. The housing licenses need posted in a visible area. So an apartment building, it's usually in the front vestibule. In a 2-family home, it's in the side entrance. Get a frame, throw it in there. It's got your name on it, your contact information, or your property management company's information. So your tenants know, so they know who to reach in the event of emergency or something like that. And if you do decide to Sell your rental property, again, that certificate of code compliance inspection is required by city ordinance. Down at the bottom here, if you want to review the entire ordinance, 1306-43 through 1306-53, that's where it encompasses the entire ordinance when it comes to housing licenses, responsibilities for landlords, etc. So the housing application has gotten easier as the years go by. We went on this platform January 7th, 2019. It's been refined and dialed in pretty good. We opened up housing license season September 1st, as you can see on the screen. So that's when we start sending those housing license reminders. If you're a new buyer or a new property owner and you're applying for a new license, you won't get that kind of notification. So we start notifying everybody 9/1. Housing license late fee notifications go out November 1st. The link is right here on the screen. That's for that Citizen Serve portal. Pretty user friendly. You go in, you create an account just like you do with Amazon or anything like that. Once your account's created, you can log in, take care of your information for there. You create your user account, fill out the license application, submit the payment. Once the payment's submitted, my front office staff issues that housing license. The system will automatically generate an email with your housing license attached. So you can just print that out and throw it in a frame, put it in a conspicuous space. If you have any questions regarding that application process, that number on the screen, 216-529-6270. If you call that, it rings 16 phones down here. All my staff were all cross-trained on how to answer questions. So anybody that picks up the phone would be able to answer any question you have. Finalizing the application, filling out the application. To the right of your screen, this is how the fee breaks down for the licensing. So for your condos, $45 per unit. A rooming house containing 2 or more tenants, $60 a unit. Non-owner occupied 1 or 2 family structures, $75 per unit. 3 family dwellings, $60 per unit. If you occupy one of those units, then you pay $60 for 2 units, not the third. All other occupied structures, $45 per dwelling unit. Any payment made after November 1st, that's when the late fees kick in. $25 per dwelling unit. So single family home, 25, 2 family home, 50. It gets really expensive if you have a multifamily apartment complex. So just be sure that, you know, you write that date down on the calendar, throw out your calendar, your iPhone, just to make sure. There is a cap, it's $3,500. So if you own a substantially large building, that housing license fee will never be greater than $3,500. The vacant property structure that we talked about earlier, that's $200 per structure per structure, whether it's a 2-family home, single family home. And again, we retain that information in the event of an emergency. First responders need contact information, or we need to take care of somebody. We understand that the property's vacant. You might be holding something that could be stuck in probate. You know, we'll work with you, but you, again, make sure that exterior of that place is maintained. This was new in 2022, and this was actually due in November of 2022. We had an issue a couple of years back with a parking garage failure. That made us take a step back and review some items in our ordinance. When it came to below ground parking structures, above ground parking structures, including 10 or more spaces, and any apartment building 4 stories more in height above grade plane. If it's one of those half stories underground, that counts. But this is your responsibility to retain an engineering report every 3 years that the facade of the building that meets the requirement, as well as the parking garage, has a clean bill of health, or at least safe bill of health with a little bit of minor maintenance issues. So categories on the right-hand side of your screen. So the building has to be 30 more years in age. It's pretty easy around here. You know, everything's at least in its first 100 years of life. 4 or more stories above height, above grade plane, subterranean parking garage, above ground parking structure with 10 or more spaces. If you have any questions regarding that requirement, you can feel free to call me direct, 216-529-6295, or shoot me an email. If you give me a call, I'm pretty good at getting back to you by the end of that business day. If not, I'll get you back by the morning. Or you can shoot me an email and I'll get back to you pretty quick. Some quick resource links, CitizenServe. Forgot to mention, not only is that your customer facing portal for your housing license, but that's also your portal. You can apply for building permits, any zoning, any architectural board of review. You can submit construction documents through that for plan review. You can, once you start using that platform, it builds a history with the property. So you can, hey, when was the last time I remodeled the kitchen, or anything like that? You can go back and it'll track your permit. And then when we do our inspections, that system gets updated. So all your inspection notes fall underneath your CitizenServe portal login. The Residential Code of Ohio, which many of the property owners fall under, that's 1, 2, or 3 family home. There's a link to that. Now that Residential Code of Ohio is for new construction alterations. That's how you get to the state building code. The important one underneath that, it's our City of Lakewood zoning code. 1306 is where we in the building department live. So that encompasses everything that falls under our property maintenance code. So if you have some extra time, you want to dive in, you can look at 1306, and that'll, give you required temperatures for the dwelling units, safety and sanitation code. It all falls under 1306. Our department hours, we start picking the phones up at 8 o'clock. Day ends at 4, Monday through Friday. So we're here. We're located in the lower level of City Hall. If you come in the front doors facing Detroit, you'll walk past a couple bailiffs, go through security. They'll be more than happy to direct you downstairs. And you can have questions about your rental property or a construction project coming up, or, you have a building code question, you have an ordinance question. We're not the big bad building department. We really do aim to please. We do a really good job. I have extremely knowledgeable staff. We're here to help. So if you have any questions, feel free to give us a call, 6270. Again, 16 phones will ring. Our email address that gets checked daily. And once you complete the landlord training seminar, once you listen to everybody's presentations, there's a link down here. That link takes you to a form on our city website. You can go ahead, fill that form out, that gets saved, and then you completed your landlord training seminar for that year. Because this does need done annually along with the housing license. If you have any questions regarding your rental property, maybe a neighboring property is an issue, you want to file a complaint, we get calls for everything down here. So we're more than willing to help. Again, I appreciate your time. I appreciate your investment in the community. And believe it or not, even though I am the building official, when you call me direct, I do pick up the phone. You might even get me when you call 6270. So have a good night, have a good morning, have a good evening, and thank you for sitting through our seminar. And if you have any questions, feel free to give us a call. Thank you.
My name is Andrew Fleck. I'm the assistant prosecutor and the assistant law director here for the city. I run the city's criminal nuisance program. I'm going to talk to you for just a few minutes today about what the criminal nuisances are and how you can avoid one. As a landlord in the city of Lakewood, you can receive a nuisance notification letter from the city for any criminal activity that originates from your property and occurs over and over. Repeated visits from members of our different departments, building department, fire department, police department, are some of the more frequent things that do cause those type of responses. We feel that the owners of properties, landlords, are in the best position to take control of those nuisances. You are the ones that control who is renting your property. and you are ultimately responsible for the activity that's going on there. Well, maybe you don't live there. You are applying for licenses with the city and generating income from those rentals, so that we expect you to take responsibility and to take control of those situations. We've had this law since 2008. When we do send out a nuisance notification letter, it'll have an estimate in it. The estimate is for anything that the city has to use to abate the problem that's going on. So as an example, let's say that you have a frequent noise problem. One of your tenants plays their radio all the time and the police constantly go over to the house. After we've received a sufficient number of calls, we'll send you a letter. Dear Mr. Doe, that your property at 123 John Street has become a nuisance. Here is a copy of the calls that the city has gone on. Here's the estimate that it's cost the city $276 or whatever you may have in abating the nuisance and writing people citations, or just going over and advising them to turn it down, whatever the situation may be. We're not required to write a citation in order for it to be considered a nuisance, just to verify that the activity is occurring and within 1,000 feet of your property. Once you don't have to pay anything at that time, but if we get a third incident at your property within 1 calendar year from the first date, then we can send you a bill from then on. These are the frequent things that we typically see as criminal nuisance: disorderly conducts, noise violations, drugs and gambling, littering, health and safety, alcohol, animal violations. The ones in red are the most common. Sex offenses, theft, weapons, vandalism, obstructing official business, building code things, high grass, weeds, rats, garbage on your property, any felony offenses. In 2015, I believe we added false alarms for police calls. Recently, in the last couple of months, we've added false alarms for fire calls. So be aware that having a alarm system at your property and not properly training people how to use it can generate a nuisance for you as the owner. The full representation of the Lakewood Criminal Nuisance Code is in Lakewood Codified Ordinance 510. I posted the link here so you can see how to get directly to that. You can read the code. It gives you kind of a more detailed explanation. I'm just kind of covering the bases here. Evidence of 2 misdemeanor or minor misdemeanor offenses or any 1 felony offense will trigger the writing of the nuisance notification letter. In addition, 3 false alarms in 6 months or 4 in a year will trigger that same letter. We send a letter out to the property owner. So a lot of times the letter is not going to the tenant. Sometimes if I can tell that it's not an owner occupied property, I do try to send the letter also to the tenant so that they're aware that this is a problem. But we do expect you as the property owner to be handling majority of that situation and not rely on us to be notifying your tenant for you. We expect you to respond with some type of plan of action. The best practice is to respond to us in writing and tell us what it is that you are doing or aren't doing, or what problems you're having with the tenant. If you've begun an eviction, how long you expect that would take. If you've properly screened tenants, all kinds of things. But response in writing is preferable. That way we have a copy of it. Email is acceptable. We can put it in the file and keep it in there so that we know how you're responding to the property. If we continue to receive problems, we haven't received anything in writing from you, we'll assume that you're doing nothing and continue to proceed accordingly through the nuisance code situation. Like we said, it's 2 minor or minor misdemeanor or minor misdemeanor offenses, or 1 felony offense within a calendar year. If you receive a subsequent offense, it goes for an additional year from that offense. So let's say you had a violation on January 1st and June 1st, and on September 1st, we have your 3rd violation. We'll send you a letter. The look back period for the city purposes will be to January 1st. And if you don't have any more violations by January 1st, then you'll go back to the beginning. The process will be over for you and you'll start fresh. If, however, on December 31st, you get a new violation, it starts a new year at that point from December 31st to the following December 31st. And if you could go 364 days and another violation happens on December 30th, then you'll have another year from then. It's until you have a successful year from the first violation to the last without having any subsequent calls to your property for the same type of activity. The owner gets assessed if we get the third one, it's called the nuisance declaration. You'll get assessed the actual cost that the city spends abating. So that's the time that the law department spends reviewing calls, the time the police department spends, the time the fire department spends, or building department, whatever department it is. If they drive any vehicles, how much gas, mileage, paper, stamps that we have to send the stuff out to you on, all of it gets aggregated. It'll be put on, like I said, the first estimate during the notification, and then it'll be sent as an invoice if you receive a third violation within the year. If you don't pay the violation, it is due within 30 days, then they'll put a lien, the city will put a lien on your property via the taxes, and you'll end up paying it that way. If you don't agree with the declaration of nuisance, you can request a reconsideration to the mayor's office within 30 days of the declaration. If the mayor decides to uphold the declaration, then you have the right to appeal it to the Board of Nuisance Abatement Appeals. It's very rare that we let things get to that level. Most of the time, we're able to work it out either by us notifying you that there's a problem at your property and you want to take action, or us sending a bill or two. Usually gets the job done. Kind of makes it easier for everyone in that way. We have had a couple cases go to the Nuisance Board of Appeals, but not very many. This is just touching on what I already said, the wage of the city people that are called to the scene, use of the vehicles, invoicing, issuance of the lien. Could be done through the auditor's office, or the city could take a civil action against you. If you do come before the nuisance board, you can prevail if you can prove that you weren't the owner at the time of the nuisance, or you were taking every feasible action to rectify the no nuisance problems. If you have a real problem tenant and you're doing everything you can, we're not going to hold that against you, but we are going to take a look at it. And if we can determine that you're not doing what you need to do to get the situation resolved for the neighbors in the neighborhood, the enforcement action is going to be taken on behalf of the city. Some successful things that people have done to show us that they're taking care of it: evicting tenants, enforcing terms of their leases agreements, complying with your landlord obligations in ORC 5321.04. We've had over 400 properties that have been placed in the nuisance program since 2009. We've only had 6 get to the board to that level. Like I said, most of the times we're able to come to a satisfactory resolution. So how can you avoid getting to the point where you have a chronic nuisance occurring at your property? You can screen your tenants, doing background checks, searching court dockets, at least here, probably Cleveland, probably Cuyahoga County would be good places to start. All those are free. It's about, you can go on there, you don't have to put in your name, you don't have to put in anything other than a person's name, and you can see what kind of cases have been generated against them. You can see if they've prior been evicted. That's good information for you to know. If they have prior criminal history and whatnot, you can see all that stuff if you're looking in the proper court. Respond when we send you a notice notification. Call us, send us an email, something in writing. Hey, here's what my plan of action is. I'm going to do X, Y, and Z, so that we know that you're taking care of the problem. It's not going to be a situation where we're kind of allowing this stuff to cross in the mail and hitting you with violations that you've been addressing, but you just haven't gotten back to us. We want to know what you're doing right away so that we can properly decide how to proceed forward if we continue to receive calls. Ultimately, it's your responsibility. Your property is your responsibility, so you need to check on your property. If you live out of town, it probably means driving by every once in a while, see what's going on there, if the place is being kept up, if there's been any problems or whatnot. These are some resources for you. You can go to lakewoodoh.gov, as Brian said, put in here how to get exactly right to the landlord training seminar where the best practices book is. This is the link for that. So you can go to apply, register at the top banner, select landlord training seminar. All those information will be there. There's also information on proposed screening tools, rental agreements, crisis resolution, things of that nature. You know, this is an important part of our city. The city does have 52% non-owner occupied properties. So we do take absentee landlords very seriously. If you have any remaining questions, I've put my email here and my phone number direct to my desk. You can give me a call. You can send me an email with any questions you might have. And again, here at the end is another link just to the codified ordinances for the city of Lakewood. The nuisance code is under section 510. So you can check that out. If you have any questions, give me a call back.